Welcome back to our next section of the webinar, and I will now hand you over to our mental health expert, Sasha. So over to you, Sasha.
Thank you, Khadija, for that lovely introduction earlier. And thank you, participants, for staying on with us. It has promised to be a very exciting session, so please try as best as possible to stay until the end, because we have lots of Q&A for you, as mentioned by Khadija earlier. So earlier she mentioned that yes, I work as education and mental health practitioner. So I work currently in London with the London Borough of Sutton, where I provide training as it relates to trauma and attachment, and also just providing therapy. And aside from that, I also operate with Caribbean countries, primarily Jamaica, through my company known as Promise Society, and just doing some trauma work. So today I really want to touch on trauma and attachment, and looking specifically at how our unresolved trauma sabotages our future. So looking at those early experiences, what is it that people encounter during those early years, and how do these early experiences detail the way in which we behave in later life? So the first concept that I want to talk about is the concept of attachment. And some of you may know what attachment is, some of you may not know, and that's okay. So when we talk about attachment, really, attachment was pioneered by this researcher and clinician by the name of John Bowlby. And he saw attachment really as the universal need for individuals to create affectionate bonds. But over 60 years of research has taught us that attachment is not just the mere relationship between a child and their caregiver, but it also encapsulates the environment and the family context. So when we talk about the environment, we are talking about where it is that an individual resides. And aside from that, who are the key persons within that environment that you interact with, and those persons that have an impact on your behavior and the things that you learn, and importantly, how that environmental experience impact on your genes. So earlier Khadija talked about epigenetics, and so it's about how the environment impacts on gene expression. So that's it in a nutshell. Now, when we talk about attachment, it's also seen as an evolutionary process. So that means that it's not constant and our patterns tend to change. So that means based on our experience that we have with, let's say, our parents, or if you weren't, maybe brought up with your mother or your father, and maybe you were brought up with an aunt, or you were brought up with someone else. How is it that those early attachments that you've developed, did they influence you to the point that you developed what we call a secure attachment, so a very positive attachment? Or was it a situation that your experiences were very harsh, and based on those experiences, you might develop what we call insecure attachment styles? And there are different types of that, which I'm going to talk about in a second. Now, the other thing about attachment is that it is said to be transmitted across generations. My apologies, that's my watch. And when we talk about it being transmitted across generations, what it is saying is that based on research, so if we grew up in a family setting, for instance, where our mother was, let's say, insecurely attached, there is high evidence to support the fact that that parent, their offspring, so child or children, might also develop insecure attachment. Or if it's a situation where the parent, so your mother, experienced a very positive environment during their early years, they may have developed secure attachment. And because they've developed secure attachment, they then pass that sort of attachment to you, and you then develop a secure attachment unless you were raised in another setting with someone else. And aside from the attachment, it also goes hand in hand with what we call trauma, so unresolved trauma. So how those negative experiences that, let's say, your parents or your caregivers would have experienced, how do those negative experiences, transfer onto you and now impact on your later life? Now, when we're thinking about attachment and how attachment is formed, it's important to first explore how it is that we, develop this attachment in the very first place. And when we talk about this, it's important to look at what we call the infant attachment cycle, or the first year of life cycle. So that goes all the way back until you were a child. So looking at your needs. So within those early years, you know that we wouldn't have the requisite skills and knowledge to be able to do things for ourselves. So be able to feed ourselves, clothe ourselves, provide shelter for ourselves. And so we need our caregivers and our parents to be able to provide us with that. So as babies, we tend to express our needs by some sort of arousal. So we might do this through crying to our caregiver to say, we need food, we need warmth, we need some form of support. Now, if that need is met by the parent or the caregiver in a very positive, way, a very attuned way. So it's not just providing you with that, but just tapping into, why is it that you might be upset? Why is it that you might be distressed? So your caregiver is always meeting that need for you. Now, over time, if it is that your caregiver is consistent and your caregiver is attuned, then you tend to develop what we quote unquote call trust. So you trust that your caregivers will be reliable and your caregivers will be there to support you if something else happens within your life. Now, a very important thing about the infant attachment cycle, or the first year cycle, is that not only do we rely on our parents and caregivers to be able to provide us with those basic needs and support us so to be attuned, but we also rely on them for us to be able to regulate our emotions. So whenever we cry and we become quote unquote dysregulated, we require our caregiver to come in, provide us with a hug, allow us to become relatively calm. Now, once your caregiver has provided that, they have acted as what we tend to call a co-regulator. And over time, you will tend to learn how to be able to regulate your own emotions. So your parents always being there to help you to navigate through that difficult time, you will automatically learn how to calm yourself down, how to be able to wait. So not to know that, okay, then I'm crying, someone is going to readily provide what I need, but knowing that it's okay to wait and it's okay, someone will be there to provide for you. Now, as mentioned, if you experience a very positive environment where when you indicate your needs, your caregiver or your parent is very supportive and very attuned, then over time, you tend to develop what we call a secure attachment. So what the secure attachment is saying is that whenever there is a threat in the environment, so whenever something happens to us, we know how to communicate that threat to our parents or whomever it is that is looking after us. Now, we know that that parent is going to be predictable and that parent is going to be attuned. So we know that the parent is going to be there. And more importantly, we know that the parent is going to help us to calm down and regulate. So even when we get older, we know that if something happens, we can always turn to mommy, we can always turn to daddy, or we can always turn to that aunt, uncle, whomever it is that we grew up with. Once they were quite positive towards us, if something happens, they would be the first person you're on a phone call with to say, help me sort through this situation. And then once they've assisted you, you're up and ready and chirpy to go back into the environment and do something else. So to take on new obstacles, to take on new challenges, and knowing that even though those challenges might come, you know that you will have somebody behind you that will be your rock to support you. But the challenge is that you have some children that do not experience that. And I'm not saying that it's because parents are not trying their best. So there are lots of children that are born in environments where it's a single mother, and or it's a single father, or it's a situation where mother and dad, they are actively working to be able to take care of the children. So they might not be home as readily as how they would want to, or there might be other challenges aside from that may influence their ability to care for a child. Now, in this situation where the child communicates their needs, so you would communicate your need to your caregiver or to your parent, and that need is not met. So you continuously ask for food, you continuously ask for warmth, or when you're upset, you go to your mother, you go to your daddy, and you're crying and you're waiting for them to support you. And they're not providing you with that support. Over time, what happens is that you develop what we call mistrust. So this mistrust stems from your caregiver being unreliable and unattuned. So they do not tap into finding out from you, why is it that you're distressed, right? Or they wait for you to cry excessively before it is that they meet your need. So what happens is that you develop the mistrust, but also you develop a generalized understanding that you cannot trust other people around you. So it's not just mommy and daddy, but when you get older, you might not want to trust the teacher. You might not want to, when you get a little bit older, you get yourself into different relationships. So not just, relationship with a spouse, but also friendships that you might develop with other persons. You might have negative thoughts towards those individuals because of those inconsistencies that you receive from your caregiver or from your mom and dad. And again, the most important thing also is that, like I said earlier, within those early years, you rely on your parent and caregiver to act as I said, your co-regulator. So to help you to be able to calm down and regulate your emotions, so to get you calm. So if they're not there to help you with that, what happens is that you acquire feelings of rejection, but more importantly, you are not able to regulate your emotions, or you have difficulties regulating your emotion. So when something happens within the environment, it becomes chaotic. There's no one for you to turn to, or you're in that fight, flight, freeze. So you're trying to solve, how is it that I am going to rectify this situation? And that's where you also develop now the different insecure attachment styles that you tend to see. And these attachment styles are what we call the avoidant attachment style, the anxious attachment styles, or the disorganized attachment style. So what the avoidant or the dismissive is that it could be where you are very much uncomfortable with closeness or distance or rejection, and you don't readily depend on other people, or you are sometimes compulsively self-reliant. So because you're not used to other persons being supportive of you, you decide that the only person that I can rely on is myself. So it's very hard when you form friendships or when you form other relationships. It's very hard to put confidence in other people for them to be able to maybe carry out a task for you, because you're thinking, I'm not used to anybody doing anything for me, so why should I trust that person? So that's where you become very dismissive. Or it could be a situation where you become very much anxious or preoccupied. So you constantly worry about being rejected or being abandoned, because it could be a situation where within those early years, again, the caregiver wasn't around. And so mommy wasn't there. She was never there when you want somebody to talk to. daddy is never there when you want. Again, auntie is never there. You're many times, alone by yourself. So you get, when you want to form now friendships or partnerships with other people, you worry that a day will come where you're not going to see that person. You might go home and your husband is not there, or you might build a friendship with someone else and you're trying to call them on the phone, and you are thinking that there's going to be a time when they're not going to answer my call. So you become very anxious and preoccupied with what might happen. So quote unquote, even if the person displays very positive attitudes towards you, you're off this thinking that they're never going to be around. So I will expect it, at any point in time. And I think Fazia mentioned that earlier when she shared, a story around the individual. So she shared a similar story. So I would describe this person as being very much preoccupied. Now, the last attachment style is what we call the insecure attachment style, is what we call the unresolved or the disorganized. And this is where the individual is unable to tolerate closeness, or past traumas tends to intrude on the relationships. So it's so severe that because of those experiences, so it could be severe trauma that happened during those early years, that makes it very difficult for that individual to quote unquote enter into a relationship. And then what they do is they turn into those, self-sabotaging, behaviors, or rely on other things, such as, rely on substances, or they tend to become quote unquote what we call very much ambivalent. So they might tend to be very boisterous, or they might tend to be very violent as a way of expressing themselves. And importantly, they might suffer from, psychological problems because of those severe, histories of being in very severe, situations where they would have been exposed to trauma. And aside from the trauma, not having those loving and nurturing individuals within their life to help them to combat those things that would have happened. Now, you might be wondering, Sasha, I get what you just said. I get the attachment, but how is this relevant to me now? Why is it so important? Now, and this is where I'm going to say to you, understanding attachment is very, very essential, because it's from those early relationships that we tend to develop our core beliefs. So what the thoughts that run through our minds. And it's from those early relationships that we develop a template of the world, or a view of the world. And this is what we call the internal working module, right? So if we experience our caregivers to be very positive, very attuned, very reliable, and we are secure in our relationships, then we tend to have very high self-esteem. We tend to be very confident, and we tend to form relationships quite easily. And then in terms of how our internal working module acts, so in terms of our core beliefs, we tend to have three. So we have a core belief as it relates to ourselves, so how we perceive ourselves. We have a core belief as it relates to other persons, and we also have a core belief as it relates to the world around us. So in relation to a positive child, or a child that is secure, and their core beliefs about themselves, that core belief would be, I'm worthy, I'm loved, I'm valued, because their parent or their caregiver taught them that they were loved and valued by not just providing, food and shelter, but being there to support them whenever difficulties, arise. And it's not just, major difficulties, but simple issues that would arise when you're a toddler. So maybe learning how to fix a toy, doing something, and your mother is always there supporting you, navigating you through that. In terms of the core belief that that secure child would have about parent or others would be that they are trustworthy, they're reliable, and adults in general are reliable. And in terms of their core beliefs as it relates to the world, it's the core belief that the life is worth living and people are good. Yes, there are bad people, but when something happens, I have people to readily assist me. Now, for children or individuals who have those compromised attachments, so those harsh experiences, so we talked about, the insecure that we talked about. Now, again, the three core beliefs of self, core beliefs of others, and core belief of the world. So the core beliefs of self could be, I'm unlovable, I am bad, I'm unwanted, because they've experienced family members or individuals who were very harsh towards them, who weren't consistent, and persons who were just never around. And in terms of their core belief as it relates to others, they might see those individuals as unreliable. They see them as, unwanted. And more importantly, they don't feel as though they can trust those persons. And in terms of the core belief as it relates to the world, they might feel that, life is not worth living, right? Because I've experienced all these different things that has happened to me, and there hasn't been any, consistent individual within my life to be able to support me. So what sort of view must I have about the world? Because everything that I've witnessed so far is harsh circumstances. And so that's it as it relates to the internal working module, just to say that all those early experiences shape the way in which we perceive the world around us. So everything that happens to us details how we behave later on in life, unless we change our environment and unless we access very supportive, supportive individuals or supportive services that can help us to combat what would have happened to us in early life. Now, that now leads to my next point, and this is where I'm going to talk about trauma. But before I get into that, I just want to pause to check to see if there is anyone that have any questions whatsoever. And Salia, if you could just check in the chat, or if anybody wants to unmute and ask a question, I'm more than happy to answer that. No? All right.
There are no questions. You can continue, Sasha.
All right, thanks, Salia. But if you have any questions whatsoever, please feel free to unmute and ask the question, or you can punch that question in the chat functions. And Salia, if you could just pick that up for me, and I will answer in due course.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sasha.
So the other concept is the concept of trauma. Now, when we talk about trauma, it's important to understand that it is not divided from the concept of attachment, because we can be traumatized by our attachment figures. So again, if we experience very harsh circumstances from our parents and or caregivers, so a parent that was emotionally, abusive, a parent that was physically abusive, then that is traumatic. That impacts on the attachment, but that is trauma in and of itself. But when we talk about trauma, it's important to acknowledge what we call developmental trauma. And this is trauma that happens generally within those early years. So again, it happens within that first year infant life, but also trauma that happens before you were born. So trauma that happens within the womb, and fast forward, trauma that happens after birth. So other experiences that you may have encountered. And the reason why we talk about, developmental trauma and its impact is because the earlier you experience various types of trauma, the more detrimental it can be on your trajectory later on in life. So how devastating it can be on your physiological development, on your psychological development, and more importantly, your ability to thrive altogether later on, to thrive in education, thrive in your personal life, and thrive even in your spiritual life. So all of those are very, very important. Now, when we talk about trauma, the first trauma that I want to talk about is prenatal trauma. So we talk about prenatal trauma and its impact on what we quote unquote call postnatal development. So what happens when you are born. So in terms of prenatal trauma, sometimes when you go to, the doctor or you go to access services, they might ask, about your history. So what happened? Do you have any idea of what happened during pregnancy? Because this helps them to inform what might be happening to you right now. So what, researchers have found and clinicians have found over the years is just how significant, development within the womb impacts also on development after birth. So if it's, and for instance, if there's a situation where, well, let me use the case study that Khadija mentioned earlier. So we had Shakira whose mom and dad were constantly arguing, and that might lead to domestic violence. So if this was a situation where when Khadija was, in the womb, if it was a situation where mom and dad were even fighting during that time and there was DV during that time, that may have impacted on Khadija. So Shakira's development. So it could be that Shakira's mom was extremely stressed. And what we know about stress is that when you're stressed, there's a hormone that is released, which we call cortisol, and that hormone passes to the fetus. Now, at various time within fetal development, if there are high levels of that hormone passing to the fetus, that can impact on when the child is born. So it could be that Shakira is born with cognitive, what we call cognitive deficits, or it could be that Khadija is born oversensitive to life stressors. So even though she might not be able to recall what happened in the womb, because again, it was a fetus, but the body stores all that information. So even though the mind cannot remember, the body remembers. And also for children who experience, trauma very early in life, so from about 0 to 5 years of age, they might not have the knowledge to be able to remember or be able to recall what has happened to them, but their body stores all of that trauma as what we call sensory memories. So their body, you might remember the scent. So for instance, if a child was sexually abused, they might remember the scent of their perpetrator. So if they go into an environment where they smell something that is very similar, right, they might become very fearful and very anxious. Or it could be another sensory issue that triggers that person. So it could be the touch. So maybe wherever the perpetrator touched the person, if you touch, let's say, Shakira at specific points, she might become very anxious. So if you touch an abused victim, let's say on their back, and that's how the perpetrator used to touch them, then they might become very anxious because of that. And also in terms of prenatal trauma, some other things that we know about are things such as if persons misuse substances, we know that that has been linked to what we call quote unquote neurodevelopmental disorders. So things along the lines such as ADHD. So it's just important to understand how prenatal trauma impacts on development, not just for us, but development for other persons. Now, so fast forward from prenatal trauma to where there are other experiences now after birth. So it could be the experience of DV, which Shakira encountered. It could be separation. So, you know, a child being pulled from their mom and dad and brought somewhere else. It could be other things such as emotional abuse, physical abuse, or things even such as a global pandemic that can be traumatizing for a lot of persons. We know also about refugee experience, but also if you have a child that moves from, let's say, place to place, or, you know, from caregiver to caregiver, that level of instability can also be traumatizing because that individual may not have developed an attachment, so any form of relationship with anyone whatsoever, and that influences how it is that they form relationships with other people. So these are just some things, you know, that you need to consider. And again, you might say to me, Sasha, I understand, you know, these different things, but how does that impact on my life now? Why is it so important? And this is where I will say to you, it is very important because of the impact that those experiences have on the body. And what I'm going to talk about now is the impact that that has on your brain development, so your ability to function as an individual. So whenever there is stress within the environment, our brainstem area, so if we use our hand to detail how the brain works, this would represent what we call our brainstem, and this will represent our limbic area, and this will represent our prefrontal cortex, which is the front part of our brain. But whenever there is stress within the environment, the brainstem area, or the back of your neck, tends to be the one that is generally active, because that's the one that supports you whenever there is stress, whenever there is threat. So once that is activated, you either fight, you either run, or you either freeze. Now, and that's because it's a way of keeping us safe. So when we experience different types of stressors, such as what you're seeing on the slide, so, you know, maybe getting the COVID vaccine, that's described as a sort of positive stress, because it would be considered to be something that's normal and essential because it's there to save your life. Or if it's something that we classify as a tolerable stress, so you may have, you know, fell and, you know, broke a bone, but why it's tolerable is because it's only for a short duration and you have individuals around you that can support you through that. So what happens is that when your brain sees this threat, it is activated, so fight, flight, freeze, but then it is deactivated because you are supported and it's just short. However, if it's what we call a toxic stress, and toxic stress are the things that I mentioned earlier, so the domestic violence, the physical abuse, the sexual abuse, this is something that is considered to be very severe and very prolonged or very protracted. Now, what happens is that as it relates to toxic stress, the frequency and the duration of that stressor impacts considerably on your development, physically, emotionally, and mentally. And what also happens is that the longer you are within that environment, the longer the brainstem area, so the longer your stress response system is activated. So if your stress response system is continuously activated, so for instance, you have Shakira, she's in a home where mom and dad is continuously fighting, then she's continuously in that stress response system. Should I run, right? Should I freeze, or should I fight? Should I go and support mommy? Or should I run away from this house? Or should I just remain in my room cuddled up? But the most important thing is that it's always happening. And so she's always in that zone. So when she's always in that zone, what happens is that the other sections of the brain cannot develop. So the limbic area of the brain, which is responsible for attachment and your ability to form relationships, it's unable to develop. And more importantly, the part of the brain that helps you to think correctly, that helps you to organize, that, you know, is responsible for what we quote unquote call executive functions. So your ability to thrive in school, work on a mathematical, you know, lesson, things like that. All of that is severely impacted because you're continuously trying to stay safe. And so that's the reason why you will find that people who have histories of trauma tend to struggle with relationships and also may struggle in regards to education. So in regards to properly organizing, properly planning, and that's because they've continuously been in that era and they haven't moved to a different environment where they can get very, you know, they can be nourished, they can be supported, and their brains can actively develop. And what I've done is just inserted this slide just to show you how the brain works under normal processes. So whenever there's a threat, we tend to do 7 things. So if there's a car coming down the road, right? You tend to observe that car coming. You tend to interpret what, input that information. You tend to interpret it, process it, and think about what is going to happen. So you start evaluating what you're going to do. And then you plan. So should I run across the road? Should I continue walking? Should I run? Or should I retreat? And that's where you plan and then you move into the acting. So that's when you start to do what it is that you've decided upon doing. So that's under normal circumstances. But for someone who, like I said, you know, they have been in that toxic environment where the brainstem area, their survival system. So Shakira is continuously in the household, mom and dad continuously fighting. Her alarm system is continuously triggered. What happens is that that 7th stage is compromised. So whenever there is a stimuli or whenever there is a threat, the only thing Shakira can do is observe, interpret, and act. So things such as processing, evaluating, and planning, you're not able to do. So you know, when you get upset or something happens, they tend to say to you, calm down before you respond, right? And because whenever you are within that fight, flight, or freeze, the other sections of your brain, so your limbic area, your prefrontal cortex, so the part that responds, that helps you to think, it's closed, it's shut, it's offline. So when it's offline, the only way you can get it online is if you regulate yourself. And I told you how it is that we learn how to regulate ourselves. We learn that. We start to learn that from our parents and our caregivers within those early years. So if you didn't learn that, you might have challenges whenever there is a threat. It might be difficult for you to regulate yourself when something happens. So this is just an example of how, toxic stress really impacts on your ability to function. And what I've done also is just to include this slide that shows you a section of the brain where we call the temporal lobe. So this is a section of the brain that is responsible for what we call emotional regulation. So your ability to be able to calm yourself whenever you get upset. So this image shows the images of 2 brains. So we have, so it's a 3-year-old child, so 2 3-year-old children, sorry. So one that hasn't been exposed to any form of stress and another that was severely neglected. And the severely neglected child, this child is from Romania. So these were some children that were adopted into the UK from Romania because they were severely neglected. Now, what you can see is that the image on my left, right, which is the healthy brain, this is a child that hasn't been exposed to any form of adversity. So as it relates to emotional regulation, it is highly activated, so they can be able to calm themselves down. But in comparison to the neglected child, so they haven't been taught how to be able to regulate their emotion. What you can see is that there is low levels as it relates to emotional regulation. So they have difficulties being able to regulate their emotion. So that's what happens in a nutshell as it relates to being exposed really to toxic stress for a very long periods. Now, I know I've touched upon how trauma impacts on brain development, but it's just important to also acknowledge that there are other ways in which it impacts on us. So we know that whenever we're stressed, doctor tells us stress is not good, because when you're stressed, you tend to develop, health related issues. So you might have heart problems, stomach problems, immune systems, challenges, and there is also linked to stress and diabetes. But again, like I mentioned, whenever you're stressed, your brain stem, so the system that keeps you safe, is always alerted, and you're dysregulated, and there's all those high levels of cortisol, so the hormone that I mentioned earlier, pass into the body that is not very good for the body. So too much of it can be very destructive. But in terms of other effects, there are other things to remember, because for some persons, right, their experiences can be more profound than others, right? And so you might have issues as it relates to post-traumatic stress disorder. So persons continuously re-experiencing and reliving what may have happened to them. But there is also the fear, the anxiety, and the memory challenges that is associated with trauma. There is also the shame and the victim mindset, because there is the thinking that I am the one that caused this upon myself. I am the one that caused, my mom to react to me in that particular way, or my dad to react to me in that particular way. But also just remembering, the core beliefs that we form because of these experiences. And that's very, very, very important, because it's those core beliefs that we have to change to be able to progress and help us to, stop re-experiencing the past, but also being able to regulate ourselves and thrive. So we've had the experience, and it's been harsh, yes, it has, but how can you now survive? How can you push past the pain that you have encountered and thrive within the world? And that's what's important. So it's about restructuring those negative beliefs and putting them into more positive thoughts. So yes, you have experienced something very difficult, but is this a learning experience? Yes, it is. You can use that to inform, to motivate, to support others. So using those personal experiences, to shape the life of other people, and also just using that to be able to shape what you should and shouldn't do later on in life, but doing so in a very positive way, and not a negative way that is destructive to self. And so this leads me to the latter part of what I want to talk about, and this is the laws. So I talked about, how the trauma impacts on the brain, and I talked about, the attachments and why they're so important. And it's important now to talk about how those core beliefs, right, how those experiences inform the relationships that we form. And so when we talk about that, we talk about the various laws. And there are 5 laws when it comes on to the laws of relationship. And the first one is what you're seeing on the slide. And this is where we view we view relationships as an unparalleled opportunity. So we see, like it says on the slide, if life is a school, relationship are graduate, our graduate school. And it's again just seeing the relationship, and particularly as it relates to relationships, it's important to again understand that in terms of what we would have experienced or trauma and or attachment difficulties, this tends to play out more. So the difficulties tend to play out more in our intimate relationships. So when we have a husband, when we have a partner, that's when you see, all the fears, all the doubts, all those things that were possibly buried, all those start to, resurface. And it's about how do you deal with that? How do you deal, within that relationship and thrive? Now, the second law is we start to repeat the patterns, right? So we start to repeat the patterns of our original relationships, so those attachments. So what did I learn from my mommy? What did I learn from my daddy? What did I see? How did they treat me? And this details now how you might want to, work through your own relationship. This generally details how you respond to your partner and what you teach your partner about, loving you or supporting you. So it's about, revisiting what would have happened within those early years and look at whether or not we're repeating the patterns that we learn from those early lives. Now, the third thing is that we start mirroring. And this is where we start to mirror, right? Our unresolved past, right? Our emotional baggages. So generally, as it shows on the slide, intimate relationships are a mirror that reflects back to us parts of ourselves that we have trouble accepting from our past, right? So it could be, for example, you have a partner where you get upset because they might be extremely sensitive about something. Why is it that you tend to be so triggered about your partner being overly sensitive? It could be a situation where whenever within those early years, when you asked, for support from mom and dad, they may have said something to you like, be a big girl, grow some strength, do something. You don't need us, be strong. You can do it on your own. So because of that, you've learned to be strong, being self-reliant, and not depend on anyone. So when you have a partner that displays a very different mindset from yours, so a very different, treatment, because their experiences are entirely different from you, because they've learned that being sensitive towards something is quite normal. Crying, as it relates to something is okay. It's normal, but you see it as a failure because that's what you were told. So it becomes an issue for you because you haven't revisited that and dealt with that. So that's what we talk about when we talk about, mirroring the past. And then the fourth concept is the balance of dependency and independence. Now, again, this stems from the early relationships. So did you have, a caregiver or parent that allowed you to safely and freely express yourself? And when you express yourself, were those feelings valued? Were those thoughts valued? And if there was any form of disagreement within the household, was it considered to be normal? Because, of course, within those early years, you may have a situation where mommy said something to you or daddy said something to you, and it just didn't sit well with you. And so you responded. And was it that daddy or mommy encouraged that? So they encouraged you, to be open about what's happening. And more importantly, even the fact that you guys didn't disagree, it was considered to be normal because you guys reached a mutual agreement on that. But if it was a situation where your thoughts weren't valid, your feelings weren't considered at all, then you develop a dependency because you were taught that whatever I say go, right? whatever I say you are supposed to do, you do. So when you're in a relationship, you find that you become dependent on your partner, right? And you might want to say something and you're afraid to say something because you learned that your points are not valid. You were taught that you should, quiet, you shouldn't say anything. What I say, that's what stands. And so you carry that with you. So that's something for us to consider. So the balance of dependency and independence. And then the fifth law is just remembering that we take our attachment styles with us. So I talked about the insecure and the secure. So the secure is when you receive a very attuned parent, a very positive parent that meets your need. You become quite confident. And so through that positiveness, you're able to exude that positivity onto your offspring or onto the relationships that you build. So that's okay. And you understand that disagreements and threats within the environment, they're normal. And again, for persons who have had harsh circumstances, that's entirely different for them. So you carry with you those insecure attachment styles. So I talked about the avoidance, the disorganized, I talked about the anxious. So you take that with you. So it's about being reflective about, am I insecure? Am I secure? What happened to me when I was younger? Was I given a platform to speak? Did I have a very harsh, experience? And for some of us, it might be harsh, and it's okay if your experiences were quite harsh. It's fine. It's about now actively working on yourself, right? And not taking that with you forward, not taking that and setting, pushing that onto your offspring. And so your offspring now develops insecure attachment and have issues forming relationships with other children in school, or you not taking that into your relationship and you have difficulties now being able to communicate with your partner, or it might result into the breakdown of your marriage or the breakdown of your partnerships with other people, because it's not just babies and it's not just, partner, but you build relationships with other people. So all the friendships, all the work ships, all the ships, I tend to talk about all the ships. So just remembering that all the ships stem from the initial big ship, which is the parent and the caregiver ship. All right. And my final two slides just looks at, well, couple slides just look at what are the different things that forms a healthy and happy relationships. And I'm not going to expound on those, but as you can see, they're listed. So if you have a partner, it's about being able to balance things together. So each partner is autonomous, and you know how to, mesh both the independence and dependence sort of thing. There is shared power and control. So it's not just one person doing everything and the other person is just, sitting down, not being able to communicate. And the ability to meet each other's needs and all the others that you've seen listed there. So having good communication and problem solving skills. And then this is another thing that we tend to talk about, and it's called the URADS of the happy and healthy relationship. So being able to use self-control and not stressing out yourself and becoming frustrated on someone else, and being able to reflect on what has happened and resolve problems. And we're always going to have problems. That's what life is about. But it's our ability to repair those. We disagree. So I disagree with Khadija or Celia, and we're able to work through that. And that's normal, and it's just about not carrying grievances and understanding that nothing is personal, not taking things personal. It's our ability to adapt, knowing that everybody has different experiences and persons are not going to think the same way as we do. and life goes on. So it's about moving forward and not being stuck. And it's about do not, like it says, do not take, both are comfortable with closeness and do not take part in destructive dynamics. So just being mindful of that. And also what we call the share. So share the basic values, the interests, the moral codes and the behaviors. So similar to when you're building a house, you know, you need the cement, you need the block. It's just important when you're building relationships. It's the same process. So if the cement and the block is not together, the house is going to tumble down. So if your life is not together, you don't reflect on what's happening in those early years, all the relationships are going to fall apart. They might not fall apart now because everybody's putting their best foot forward, but it will fall apart later because you didn't lay the cement and the block properly. So it's just remembering that. And then in terms of the basic principles, again, it's about remembering the different dynamics. So looking at, you know, the family system. So looking at your experience with the family, looking at the neurobiology. So looking at, did I experience any form of trauma? May that have impacted on me? I don't want you to leave here thinking that you're traumatized. Um, but it's just looking at what may have, you know, impacted on you, and is it something that you need to work on? Looking at your attachment. It's also, and this is Khadijah's, but taking a holistic approach. So looking at the psychological, looking at the social, looking at the spiritual, which is very essential. You know, always thinking about the spiritual. There's a higher being than ourselves, so focusing on that. Focusing also on the biological and the cultural. So what sort of culture am I in, and how does that impact on the way in which I present myself, the way in which I behave, and the way in which other people, you know, view me. And then when we think about now, you know, readily moving towards change, it's about having a plan, and change is a process, and it's remembering that change is a process, and we have to take baby steps before we move to quantum leaps, right? So, you know, have a plan about how we're going to change. If we need to get a team around us to get to do that, and remembering that, you know, relationships are a vehicle of change, so we need support. We can't be by ourselves, else we're going to sink. We all need somebody in somewhere, some format. And just remembering, you know, the last part that you see there, hope is essential, and the positive expectation of success allows you to convey optimism and encouragement to yourself. And if you have a child, encouragement to your child and encouragement to your partner. Yeah, and that's it from me. Any questions? I hope I didn't bore you guys to death.
Thank you very much, Sasha, for the insightful, you know, the insights you've provided us. I'm sure we've learned a lot through this session today, and just getting to understand how, you know, our past has a huge, you know, impact on the present and the future if we don't get to go back and, you know, get to like resolve those, those things that we've experienced in the past so that we can move ourselves forward. Yeah, thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions for Sasha at this point? So if in case you have any questions, and maybe you need some time to think about, you know, your questions, just remember that we have a Q&A session at the end. So you can be able to just jot down all your questions, and then you can be able to raise them at the end. We will have a dedicated session for that. So right now, just so that we can be able to ensure that you don't leave this place feeling traumatic, we have a quick mindfulness exercise that I would like you to take part in. It's just a breath work exercise. Make sure that you're seated somewhere you're feeling comfortable, and just, sit comfortably. If you're seated on a chair, you can be able to just relax your back. So take a deep breath and exhale. Take another deep breath and exhale. Gently close your eyes. I'm here, so you can close your eyes and take another deep breath and relax your body. Just feel where you feel some tension in your body. And as you exhale, just let the tension to get out, and just feel um, that sense of comfort that you get when you release the stress that you're feeling. Now I want you to picture yourself. Picture some things that you're holding on to. Picture some things that, some things that you're holding on to from the past. It can be one thing, it can be several things. Just picture them and let your mind just inform you what you're seeing, basically. Take another deep breath and exhale. And just let go. Tell your mind that it's okay. You're now safe. You're safe from those experiences. You're safe from those situations. You're now safe. Tell your mind that it's it's very possible for you to overcome those things and be able to build a better life and a better future, no matter what you've experienced in the past. Take another deep breath and exhale. Tell your mind that everything happened for a reason, and everything happened in the decree of Allah. Even the painful experiences, tell your mind that there's healing for everything. There's healing for everything that you've experienced. Tell your mind that there's healing for everything that you've experienced. And yes, you can find the healing. And whatever that you've gone through was to make you become stronger and find healing for yourself. And also, once you've found healing for yourself, you can be able to help someone else through their own pain and suffering, because they've seen that to you've been able to transform your life. Tell your mind that it's possible for you to transform your life and move past those experiences. Tell your mind that it's possible for you to be able to build healthy relationships right now, despite having some painful experiences in the past. Tell your mind that when you do your inner work, you will be able to attract what's right for you and attract what will be able to enable you to grow and expand and transform your life and be able to become a change maker in this world and be able to get the best for the hereafter. Tell your mind that those early experiences that you may have experienced, that people did not have the knowledge and they only were able to serve you from what they had. Tell your mind it's time to forgive yourself, to forgive others, to forgive everything that you're holding on to. And to forgive, whatever the situation was, just forgive. Tell your mind it's now time to let go. Let go of those painful experiences. They're not serving you anymore. They're just making you feel stuck in your situation, stuck not to grow, stuck not to be strong. They're just limiting you to become the best version of yourself. Now tell your mind, I let go. I let go of everything. I let go of everything. It's time for me to rebuild a new life and to create new beliefs that will enable me to rebuild a new life. Now take a deep breath in and slowly exhale and say, I let go. I let go and I trust Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and I trust the process. I let go. I know there's something better for me. So I let go so that I can be able to get that better thing. I let go of those stories that are holding me back. Now take a deep breath and exhale. Take another deep breath and exhale. Take another deep breath and exhale. Slowly bring your awareness into the room and gently open your eyes. And stretch when you're ready. Now, thank you very much. I hope you found that that exercise helpful. So now we will be breaking for 10 minutes. It's going to be our last break. And then we will have Sheikha talking about, the false attachments and the psychology of people and things. And I will hand you over to Sheikha after the break. So we've got 10 minutes now, and we will be back in 10 minutes. So thank you very much.